Hello, my friends. Welcome to another episode of 30 Albums for 30 Years, 1964 through 1994, where we take a look at the most impactful albums during those years. So that's 30 albums for each one of those years. This is album number 26 of 1964. The album is Herbie Hancock's Empyrean Isles, Blue Note Records, released on November of 1964, recorded on June of 1964. It's a great one. I think you'll enjoy. I am your host, Jay Sweet. Let's check it out. Herbie Hancock's Empyrean Isles. All right, cats. Well, let's learn a little bit about Herbie Hancock. Chicago native Herbie Hancock began his early music training by playing classical music and even performed with the Chicago Symphony at the age of 11. Influenced by the playing of George Shearing, Oscar Peterson, Errol Gardner, Claire Fisher, Bill Evans, and others, Herbie Hancock was desirous to learn how to play jazz. So he then hooked up with a teacher named Chris Anderson and learned a great deal about jazz harmony. Hancock then attended Grinnell College in Iowa and graduated with a degree in electrical engineering and music. He then began working with heavyweights like Coleman Hawkins, Donald Byrd, Phil Woods, and Oliver Nelson in the early 1960s. Hancock then signed a deal with Blue Note Records to release his debut, Taking Off, in 1963, which included the funky crossover hit, Watermelon Man. Late in 1963, Hancock joined Miles Davis for what would emerge as Miles Davis's second great quintet that lasted from 1964 through 1969. The group included saxophonist Wayne Shorter, bassist Ron Carter, and a 17-year-old drummer named Tony Williams. Together, the group redefined the possibilities of jazz by pushing the boundaries of rhythmic interplay while exploring elements of free jazz without completely adopting the style. All right, so let's talk about this album. So in November of 1964, Herbie Hancock releases one of his most celebrated works, the work we're discussing today, which is Empyrean Isles, with an ensemble that included his new Miles Davis bandmates. It was basically Miles's group without Miles. Replacing Miles was Freddie Hubbard playing the cornet, which is a lot like a trumpet. So it's Freddie Hubbard, Ron Carter on bass, Tony Williams on drums. So what is an Empyrean Isle, you ask? Well, I did. Apparently, in ancient cosmologies, the Empyrean was the place in the highest heaven, which was supposed to be occupied by the element of fire. So I guess an Empyrean island is a fiery, heavenly island. It's a serious name for a serious album. As with Eric Dolphy's Out to Lunch, which also included Tony Williams and Freddie Hubbard, it is the creativity and the connectivity of the players that made this album a critical success. Included in that is the spirit of youthfulness and the sense of musical personality and discovery that can be felt organically, a feeling that cannot be defined by traditional analysis. During the making of this record, Tony Williams was about 19 years old. Hancock was 24, I believe. Hubbard was 26, and Ron Carter was only 27. So following the release of this record, Hancock continued to create classic acoustic jazz recordings on Blue Note before shifting into some serious electric funk and fusion in the 1970s, particularly with his group, the Headhunters. He even had an unlikely instrumental pop hit in 1983 with his tune Rocket. Hancock never totally abandoned traditional jazz, and we return to the idiom frequently. Quite simply, Herbie Hancock is a true master. He's a sound scientist who has remained relevant for over 6 decades. So before we move forward, I just want to share with you a personal experience I had with Herbie Hancock. Several years back, I was playing at a club called Cecil's Jazz Club in West Orange, and we were playing, I think it was Watermelon Man. It was one of Herbie Hancock's songs. And who walks in but Herbie Hancock? And if I remember correctly, he was with Q-Tip or some big hip-hop star. I wish I could remember. At the time, I wasn't into hip-hop, so I can't remember exactly who it was, but it was someone like at that high level. So I'm playing a Herbie Hancock tune for Herbie Hancock, which was weird. But he was kind enough to invite us to his table during our break, and we had a drink with him. I was a little starstruck, I think, at the time, so I didn't say much to him. But I was really impressed by his warmth towards us younger musicians. And then, of course, every musician in the club decided to sit in with our group, I think in hopes of impressing Herbie Hancock. But, maybe it's not a great story, but it was a meaningful moment for me at the time, and I was really thankful to have that experience. So before we break down each of the 4 tracks on this record, I first discussed the album with drummer and educator Steve DeLuca. Steve is an adjunct professor of music at Montclair State University, where he teaches a course called Rock and Rap as a Cultural Phenomenon. He's also a private drum instructor, and he works as a music teacher in the public schools. So Steve has made his career in music. Now, much of our discussion was centered around the talents of Tony Williams, which makes sense because Steve is a drummer and he has drums on his brain. I first met Steve around 2000 or maybe 2001 when we worked together as instructors at Andy's Music in Livingston, New Jersey. And since then, we have played on hundreds of gigs in various contexts, most frequently as members of the Platinum Band, but we have also played an incredible amount of jazz gigs as well. He's also the drummer on my record, which is simply called the J Suite Trio. Now, beyond being a fantastic musical companion, Steve is one of my closest friends. And we both have a tendency to talk, and talk a lot. And when we get together, we move in and out of different topics and go in different directions, maybe much like the musical stylings of Hancock, Carter, and Williams, but also maybe without the same virtuosity. So since we sometimes move in and out of specifics regarding the album, I added some bonus discussion material to the end of this podcast that I think you will enjoy. I did try to edit the material most related to the album for this portion of the conversation, so I hope you enjoy my conversation with Steve DeLuca regarding this fantastic record. All right, so today I just wanted to, I offered a bunch of albums to you, to join me on the podcast and give me your thoughts, and you chose this particular Herbie Hancock album. So I wanted to find out why, out of all the albums that I had suggested, why this one? What's so special about this album for you?
Well, yeah, and all the albums obviously would have been, great choices. I would have been glad to do any of them, but this is probably one of my favorite jazz albums. It has, of course, the great Tony Williams on it, and I think that this is probably, during this era, especially in '64, because he was with Miles at the time too, there's so many albums that would be great examples, but I guess the way I would put it is this is as good an example as any of his playing, and interestingly, sort of his playing with the Miles rhythm section, but instead you have Freddie Hubbard on cornet, right?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's actually not trumpet, which I have to be honest, maybe it's just me being a dumb drummer, but it's really hard for me to tell the difference between those two instruments.
Yeah, I agree, especially the way Freddie Hubbard plays it, I think.
Yes, yeah.
It was almost interchangeable. I'm sure there would be some trumpet players who disagree.
Yeah.
But yes, to my opinion, it's almost irrelevant because his musical personality seems to be
so
about
strong.
the same.
Yeah. But I don't think I would have known that Freddie wasn't playing trumpet unless you read it on the credits.
See, and I wonder if it was a decision to sort of separate the Miles Davis, connection. Like he's playing cornet and not trumpet, so it's maybe a slightly different voice,
Yeah, that's a good point. I wouldn't have thought of that. But I think also the tunes, and again, we were talking about pronunciation in the past with certain songs and Empyrean Isles. I'm going to say Liliqui Valley is probably one of my favorite jazz tunes. Tony's playing on it is just fantastic. I mean, the whole band, but like I said, this is definitely one of my favorite Tony albums.
Wow, it's interesting. I mean, out of the 4 tracks, I'm a little surprised that one was the one you chose. Why that one specifically?
Well, it's got a great melody. I like the shift, from the A section, and then I guess the B, and I think it's really a C section, right? Isn't it like A B A C as far as the form goes?
I believe so.
Yeah. And also, they were toying around with the unusual forms. Like, they might have been even, but they weren't your typical, 32-bar song forms, right? I think, I think a Liliqui Valley is 28 bars or maybe 30, something like that. And then there's One Finger Snap is a 20-bar form. So I think, a lot of those musicians who were coming out of Miles really were experimenting with those unusual phrase lengths, let's say, and Wayne Shorter would spring to mind too, his tunes. So I like that about it. And, just the interplay with the rhythm section, no matter who's soloing, is just, just prime examples of great jazz improvisation.
Right.
And then you have the sort of the tune that I don't think really has a precedent, the Egg, where it's free, but they all start playing a specific part, and I don't think they change that part until you're well into 2 minutes into the tune.
It's 14-minute long,
Yeah.
exploration. You brought up a couple good things that I kind of want to touch upon in terms of the interplay and the connectivity, and also the Miles Davis connection. I mean, they hadn't been with Miles as a group for that long, maybe a period of a few months. And yet it seems like they already kind of formulated sort of this organic connection that I think could have only been done by those 3 rhythm players, Ron Carter, Tony Williams, Herbie Hancock.
Yeah.
You mentioned it's almost free at times, but it's not free. I mean, it seems like they were very conscious of sort of towing that line between free jazz and sort of a more, traditional forms. Like, they never fully, just go completely free, which was a trend for a lot of musicians at that time.
Right. Yeah, it's not free in the same way as Ornette, let's say. There's more of a compositional structure to it.
Like, there's this elastic feel, you almost feel like it's going to fall apart at times, and then it just never does. And if you've ever tried to play along with these records, it's really hard to do, like certain records you can kind of grab your instrument and kind of jam with. And this, or any of their albums when they were together at this time, it's really hard to latch onto their feel without being present in the moment or being one of them, I guess,
Yeah, certainly. Like you're saying, that rhythm section, along with Tony, the thing that is often said about him is that, he's 17 or 18 at the time. So not only do you have this fantastically proficient player, but he's also innovative. He's got this complete new way of playing. And one of the things that he had said was that, he learned how to play like all of his idols, like Max Roach and Art Blakey, and then he decided to play whatever they weren't. So you have this completely new concept, and at such a young age, that he didn't sound like anybody else and really changed the language of the drums. And I think you could say that about each one of them. I mean, Ron Carter, at this time, Ron Carter's he's not even out of his late 20s, and he's like the elder statesman of the band.
Yeah, I mean, I could be incorrect, but I have like Williams at 19, Hancock at 24,
Yeah.
Hubbard at 26, and Carter's the old guy,
Right.
you know, at 27. And I think maybe, you know, that playing with Hubbard, you know, now you have, because they're more used to playing with Miles, I guess, at this time. So, you know, now that these are all kind of guys around the same age, although Williams is considerably younger, I guess. But that youthfulness and that like desire for experimentation seems to really filter through this album.
Right. But I think that, you know, the difference is that they could actually do it. You know what I mean? Like they were that good that they could do it. They weren't just young and you know, trying to do things that they couldn't do.
Right. From a technical standpoint, I mean,
they're
obviously all monsters, right?
Yeah. And I think, you know, with all due respect to Miles, I'm you know, we've had these kind of conversations before, and I'm pretty confident that you would agree. With all due respect to Miles, now they have somebody who's on the same technical level as them.
Well, that's a tough one.
I get it, but you know, I mean, Miles, obviously that wasn't Miles's thing, but it's amazing how one person can change what the whole band sounds like.
Yes, absolutely. I think Miles is like technicality and his virtuosity, if you will, came more in being a sort of a style innovator. That specific use of space and that realization that, you know, hey, like I'm not going to be Dizzy Gillespie. I've tried it and I really can't match him technically. So I have to find a specific voice. And then the brilliance of saying, hey, there's this 17-year-old drummer, you know, and these 20-year-old musicians, and I need to, maybe that being around that youth and that energy will help propel my band. I mean, part of his greatest skills was just formulating an ensemble around him that helped him to sort of change his sound and kind of leaving them alone to figure it out while doing so.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, in his autobiography, Miles called Tony Williams the creative spark of that band. And then I guess at one point he felt like he wasn't keeping up. And Tony, you know, here's this 17-year-old kid with Miles Davis. And he said to him, why don't you practice?
Could you imagine the balls?
and Miles said, you know, I hope I can say this. Miles said, yeah, I was having a problem keeping up with his young ass.
Yeah, you can say it. Yeah, and it kind of was, I think. But I think pretty much anyone would be, you know. I mean, the guy.
Yeah.
And just to have that confidence, like, how do you get that confidence? And maybe he just doesn't know any better, you know. But as such a young kid, like, to play in such a specific, you know, way or such a unique way. I mean, I don't even think anyone has ever even come close to like matching his style. Like, there's obviously people try to adopt it, but you hear Tony Williams play on most records, and you know that it's him, you know, which is a little bit of a harder thing. Maybe you would disagree on the drums. I don't know that, you know, you could say that about a lot of drummers, perhaps.
Well, I think, you know, what's interesting is that, you know, that he studied with Alan Dawson, who had been at Berkeley for years. And then, of course, was a private instructor, and so many great drummers went through him. Now, Alan Dawson, unfortunately, is not widely recorded, but in the last year or so, I have been trying to check out more of him. He's on some great Booker Ervin and Dexter Gordon stuff. There's a Booker Ervin, Dexter Gordon album that's got like 3 tunes on it. They're all like 20 minutes long, and it's Alan Dawson, and especially in the way that he would use the hi-hat as a third comping voice as opposed to just for the 2 and 4. You could definitely hear the Alan Dawson in Tony. You know, that he was a student. But there's so many guys that were influenced by Tony. I mean, I think, you know, I think it's safe to say that if you're a drummer after Tony Williams, you have to deal with him in one way or another, you know, even if you don't realize that you're studying him, because he changed the language of the drums so much. You know, it's like if a playwright says, oh, I'm not influenced by Shakespeare because I never read him. Well, it doesn't matter.
Right.
You know, so, I think he's that influential.
From a drummer's standpoint, what what made him so remarkable?
Yeah, I think it's like we were talking about. I think it was just his unique sound, of course, which changed over the years, which we were also discussing. But he had sort of the typical jazz sound as far as the ride cymbal that had a lot of articulation to it. And I'm saying the ride cymbal like somehow it's the cymbal's responsibility or whatever. It was him. But the cymbal had this great articulation, but it still had the warmth and the breadth that you want out of a ride cymbal. And he had just a beautiful sound on the drums and on the toms, using the bass drum kind of as a third tom, and again, along with that, the idea that the hi-hat was no longer on 2 and 4, and everybody knows that actually he played it on all 4 at times, but he also used it as a separate comping voice, both closed and open, which not a lot of people were doing at that point. And you had mentioned Coltrane and Elvin Jones. Elvin Jones started doing that kind of thing as well in a very, very different way. But I think those 2 guys, Tony and Elvin, the drum set kind of became a fully fleshed out instrument by that point. The other thing that's amazing, to your point, is that he's kind of hinting at it a little bit by the time you get to albums like Feliz de Kilimanjaro. But what's amazing to me is by the time he got into the 70s and he was doing the new Tony Williams Lifetime, the album with Al Holdsworth.
Correct.
And obviously that was a completely different thing with the fusion and him getting into rock and so forth. But it's almost like he's got a completely different vocabulary now than what he had in the 60s when he was doing, for example, this album. So not only was he innovative one time, but it was like he was innovative twice with this whole new vocabulary that he developed when he sort of changed his playing in the 70s and then into the 80s when he had his own quintet, and you had the big yellow drums and the black dot heads on them and the big cymbals and and he talked about, a lot of people were like, what are you doing with that bass drum? That's a 24-inch bass drum. That's not a jazz bass drum. And he was like, I don't care. Like, what does that mean? I'm going to play the way I play.
When you hire a guy like Tony Williams, you're hiring him you're not hiring him to be just a timekeeper. You're hiring Tony Williams because he is such an innovative voice, I think, right?
Yeah.
And we saw that with the Out to Lunch album, which we did earlier. I don't think these records would be as brilliant, or maybe they would just take a different direction, of course. But it's just he's so impactful to like the overall direction of some of these great albums,
Yeah. And interestingly, he's a drummer who, going back to Liliquy Valley, I think it's interesting that in the Latin sections he plays with brushes. So he's kind of got this Latin feel going on with brushes, which he was not a big fan of. If you think about it, obviously there's brushwork on some of the 60s stuff and the various people he was playing with, but throughout his career, you don't hear a lot of brushes. And I think on a Modern Drummer interview once, he called them cute. They asked him about brushes, and he said, "Yeah, they're cute." Because he wasn't into that. He was into playing the drums, and he wanted the drums to, he wanted people to hear the drums.
Yeah, it's I often wonder sometimes, like, kind of the gigs that we are often forced to play, which are more, where you have to almost like not bother anybody, like
right,
just use wallpaper.
Right.
Like, what would it be? Like, would Williams be able to do one? I mean, I'm sure he could do it on a technical level, but like, I think he would get fired for most of those. Like,
that might be possible. He definitely would be called too loud by various people that we know. Other musicians, other drummers say, especially about that '80s quintet, oh my God, he's so loud and he's just bashing the cymbals and I know you had done some stuff with Ron Carter, interviewed Ron Carter, and Ron Carter said, he's completely misunderstood. And I always like this. He said, people confuse power with volume. He said, Tony wasn't a loud drummer. He was a powerful drummer. I always like that, and I think that's true. I think sometimes people do confuse power and articulation, of course, which he had such an abundance of, with volume, because you're not just hanging down underneath everybody, just keeping a beat.
Understood. Right. It's almost like it's not talking loud and saying nothing. He's playing loud at times, but saying a whole lot. Like there's substance to the volume, right? It's not volume just for the sake of being loud. Interesting. So let me talk to you about this because, obviously you're a drummer, I'm a bass player, and we're really close friends. I think there's a connectivity between generally drummers and bassists. I mean, usually on most gigs you'll see them eating together, or speaking. So talk about that musical relationship, because obviously many of Tony Williams' greatest recordings are connected to Ron Carter.
Yeah. Well, the amazing thing to me is that I think Ron Carter, and I feel this way, and I'll say this not by any stretch of the imagination, putting the two of us, into their sphere, but I do feel this way about you. I think that from Tony Williams' standpoint, he had a great partner in that he always knew that Ron Carter was going to be there for him no matter how far he went out. And if you think about some of that Miles stuff, especially when they did like Four and More, where, they're doing those tunes that Miles had done for years, but now they're doing them at like, quarter note equals 300. And Tony's playing all this stuff and playing off of Herbie's solo and Miles solos, and they're doing sort of all the polyrhythmic stuff and the stuff that would become known as, metric modulation, and, a lot of musicians started to kind of clean it up and make the math, I guess you could say, more understandable. And it was a looser, more organic thing with them. But, Ron Carter was always there so that they could do that. And he was just as solid as a rock. And I think it's interesting that you don't really hear him soloing a lot of that stuff.
But he's also not there just to, like, I kind of hate this phraseology where people, and the bass player's there laying it down, holding it all together.
Well, and I just did that, but I understand what you're saying. But I wonder, when you spoke to him or when you've done research on him, has anything ever come up on why that is? Because, I mean, during that whole time, he almost seemed to like eschew solos.
Yeah, no, he didn't discuss that with me. I think Ron Carter, but what he did discuss was he always felt, and obviously this is what most rhythm section players, I think, feel, that they have a primary role to service the betterment of the group, right? So he knew his primary function was to sort of lay down a steady foundation and deviate when it was appropriate. So I think with Williams, he was able to do that. I still think, like, when I think Ron Carter, and I think Ron Carter, I think Tony Williams still, because I just feel like that was a connection that was so specific, the way they did it. And I don't think either one of them really played the same way outside of that. I mean, Ron Carter's got some amazing recordings. Tony Williams does as well, but with jazz, it's a funny thing, and people don't quite understand it sometimes, and my students don't as well. It's like, why are these guys, why is the group changing so much? Why is it, it's that, and I tried to relate it to, like, film. It's like, no, sometimes you just want to pair this actor with that actor and see what kind of magic can happen, Right. Steve, I think we got it, man. That was a good discussion.
Yeah. No, I absolutely. No, thank you. I really enjoyed it. Are we,
you mentioned the rock thing, and a big part of this year, 1964, is the British invasion, the Beatles coming to America, but also, funk music or soul music, and you can hear, some of these tunes, particularly like Cantaloupe Island, that funk element, that idea of returning jazz at times to, the terminology is often used as hard bop, but to African American elements or African elements, moving a little bit away cool jazz, where it's more classical, maybe influenced or based. Tony Williams, Ron Carter, Herbie Hancock, certainly. That you can hear the bubblings of that funk playing in their music, even on some of the tracks here.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, they were even if they weren't even if they weren't supposed to be, let's say, they were into all that stuff. I mean, Tony talked about how he was listening to the Beatles while he was playing with Miles, and obviously Herbie, not too long after, 10 years, maybe under 10 years, he was going to start doing the Headhunter stuff. So I think, I think all those guys were, they were just into music. They weren't concerned about, I think, like the best musicians, all the best musicians are, right? They're into music. They're not concerned about what the label is going to be put on whatever they're playing.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's more for, historians, and, it's these sub-genre classifications, really mean nothing, because
right.
They're individual musicians. I mean, Herbie Hancock was a classically trained piano player.
Yes. Yeah. Did he play he played like a Mozart concerto when he was like as live, like in a performance, like before he was 10, I think.
Yeah, I think I have him at the age of 11, playing with the Chicago Symphony.
Yeah, that's
I think I'll just play with the Chicago Symphony.
I don't know about you, but I don't know if I can play with the Chicago Symphony now.
No, I said, I mean, we're talking about very unique, very specific talents here.
Yeah.
And when you put them together, sometimes magic happens, and certainly did.
Are you still on record mode?
I am, but I'll get edited all this.
Well, because I wanted to, I don't know if you want to include this or not, but I just wanted to include, I'm 40 pages away from finishing your book.
You're the one guy, huh?
Yeah. So I'm at old time and country music.
Oh, okay.
So I'm literally like 40 pages away. So that's a really good book. If Jay's hasn't talked about his book, he's got a book out on the history of American music, the origins of American music, and it is definitely a good read.
I'll send you a check for saying that later on. No, I appreciate it. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
All right, man. I'll see you soon. I don't know when our next. All right, let's do this thing. Let's drop the needle on side number 1, track number 1, and the song is One Finger Snap. Now try snapping one finger to this song. You can't, because it's too fast. And you also can't because you need 2 fingers to snap with. Try doing it with one. You're going to look really foolish, like you're just kind of pointing to random things. The great Freddie Hubbard instantly showcases his absolute brilliance during his first solo. Now keep in mind that Hancock and Carter and Williams, they came together and were most associated with Miles Davis's group, whose style was often more characterized by shorter phrases and often more subtle, fragmented conversational approaches. But Hubbard comes out of the gate with this energy and this virtuosity, this excitement that seems to almost contrast the playing style of Miles Davis. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Miles Davis's playing, but it's very different. Within the first 2 minutes, Hubbard sets the overall spirit of the album, and the rhythm section is instantly responsive. Herbie Hancock then counters with his own improvisation, played against Ron Carter and Tony Williams' rhythmic conversation. And at times, I must admit, I'm so focused on Williams' constant accenting and feel shifting that I lose focus on just how brilliant Hancock is as a solo player. Then Hubbard re-enters before Tony Williams unleashes a drum solo, in which he absolutely attacks the drum set. His approach throughout shows incredible skill, but there's also this uniqueness that's forceful and primal. It's almost as if there was this sense of discovery and youthful exuberance in his playing during this solo. It's a great track. Check it out. One Finger Snap. Track number 2 is Aliloquy Valley. Now, according to the website The Wire, Aliloquy Valley is not about a geographic location, but rather an internal voyage, and these themes of journeying and subject revelation are echoed in the title. Nice title, Herbie. The performance begins with a groovy bass pattern that later morphs in and out of traditional swing rhythms. Hancock and Hubbard play inspired solos, and the dream team of Carter and Williams continue to manipulate jazz swing feels in a way that never sounds contrived or formulaic. On this track, Ron Carter, who is cited as being the most recorded jazz bassist of all time, or the most recorded bassist, period, I believe, also gets his moment to solo. And he takes some exciting risks by displaying double stops, which were these like chorded fragments, string bends, and out-of-tempo sequences. And then after searching for the right notes, he brings the group back in by playing the bass pattern from the introduction. On Aliloquy Valley, the listeners are the passengers on this inspired internal voyage. All right, it's time for a flip fantasia, which means to flip the record and drop the needle on side number 2, track number 1, which is Cantaloupe Island. I do not know if Cantaloupe Island is a real place. I hate melons of all kinds. That includes watermelon. I know, it's weird. But I like this tune, and so do many, many others. Cantaloupe Island has become a jazz classic and has been covered by many artists, including Freddie Hubbard and Donald Byrd. It has also been sampled in numerous hip-hop songs, including Us Three's Cantaloupe, Flip Fantasia, see what I did there, and Kendrick Lamar's Blow My High, Members Only. It is the most recognizable track on this album. The tune offers a slow, light groove-based funk played over a repetitive 16-bar pattern. Compared to the other tracks on the record, it's simplistic, but it grooves, so it works. Now, Blue Note Records during this period often looked for their artists to record a song or two that can serve as a crossover hit, something with a more steady groove-based drum beat. And Cantaloupe Island, or Cantaloupe Island, is in fact that song. The final track on the original LP is The Egg. The Egg is a full-out, 14-minute-long musical exploration that makes the listener question if they still even want to be on Empyrean Isles, or if they would prefer now to swim ashore. I mean, honestly, what drug did the band take on Cantaloupe Island to then lay this egg? And do I still even want an omelet? All jokes aside, the Egg showcases free jazz playing, so it's like an anything goes type of a situation. The music begins with a repetitive piano vamp played on top of a military-sounding drum beat. Hubbard then plays over top of that. Then Herbie plays some weird stuff, and at around 5 minutes in, Ron Carter is left alone to play some experimental bowed bass. It's as if a monster hatched from the egg. Then Hancock counters with a piano solo before the group suggests a more traditional type of a swing feel and more traditional swing elements. But that's then followed by more breakdowns and soundscapes. So I'm not really sure the egg is good. It may have been a little spoiled, but it sure tastes and sounds interesting. So it's really worth a listen. Yes, in fact, we did it. We made it to the end of the record, and we are better for it. So, of course, now take the record and put it back in its jacket, and let's put it away for another day. And in conclusion, Empyrean Isles is a brilliant album made by brilliant musicians with a rhythm section that would redefine jazz through their works with Miles Davis's quintet. Additionally, Freddie Hubbard was an absolute technician on the cornet and, of course, the trumpet. So it's fascinating to hear an early recording of Miles Davis's second classic rhythm section without Miles Davis and with Freddie Hubbard playing the lead instrument. All right, I want to thank you for joining me for this podcast. This was a fun one for me. And if you're interested, as always, you can go to 30albumsfor30years.com to find out more about past and future shows. I also want to thank Steve DeLuca for joining me for this cast as well. As I mentioned, he's a very dear friend, and it was great to have a discussion with him about this album. So what I've done is I've added some bonus material to this podcast. You can hear some more conversation between Steve and myself. And in addition, I will throw on a track of Steve and I playing together from one of the tracks from my album. So together, let's keep this music alive. Have a wonderful rest of your day. All right, so as I mentioned, there's some bonus material from this podcast. And I also mentioned how, Steve and I can go off on tangents sometimes, but I think there's some interesting conversation here, so I wanted to at least include it. In this clip, Steve and I discuss the song Cantaloupe Island and Blue Note's concept for adding a groove-based tune to many of their albums.
It's kind of like Herbie had almost like, and I have no idea if this is true, it's almost like he had to put a soul jazz, kind of gospel-y thing on every album, right? Because he had Watermelon Man, Cantaloupe Island is on this. One of my favorites is called Blind Man, Blind Man.
Uh-huh.
I think it's on Point of Departure is the album, which is like an expanded band, right? Tony's on it, but it doesn't have horns. It's got Grant Green on guitar. So he was kind of doing that, that sort of boogaloo, bossa nova type of groove, like on every album there was one tune like that.
Yeah, I do think there was a conscious effort by Blue Note Records to incorporate one tune that they could put as a as a single,
as a Billboard thing.
Yeah, I think with the success of like Sidewinder.
Yep.
So they went to that. They went back to that formula. Like, hey, I almost suspect that they're like, hey guys, you could do certain musicians, you could do what you want, but you got to give me one boogaloo beat or funky little thing.
Yeah.
Unless you're Eric Dolphy, where they just like, we just for out to lunch. I don't think much direction.
Go ahead, you're gonna do what you're gonna do.
Okay, so here we discuss the sampling of Cantaloupe Island and the sampling of other jazz tunes and the commercial usage of jazz. Check it out.
Just going back to this album, Cantaloupe Island, 1993, it becomes part of a hip hop hit.
Yes. Yeah. What was that? I forget.
The group?
Yeah.
It was Us Three.
Us Three. Okay.
Yeah. And it's check them out actually. They did that pretty well by blending, a little bit of jazz into hip hop.
And how many people do you think there are that now, and I guess in a way it's a good thing, but, in another way, maybe not so much, but how many people know that tune, right, because of that, and think that that's, not even think that that's the original, like they don't even know where it came from.
Oh, 100%. I mean, even when you present your classes, like, let's say Take Five, for example, I play something like that. Oh, that's from that car commercial. No, it's in that car commercial.
It's not from
that car commercial.
Yeah. Well, that's all the people who think that Walk This Way was done by Run DMC, and then they and then this other group that I don't know called Aerosmith was tagging along.
Yeah, right. And but I guess it's kind of neat that it exists in both ways, and I think more and more I've noticed, like, I've been trying to get more into the hip hop thing, and more and more I'm noticing that people are looking at the source to find out where did that loop come from, where did that sample come from. And maybe in doing so, it does help. Anything that helps the discovery of music of the past, especially quality music of the past, I think is is a positive thing.
Yeah. And a lot of times those samples, it's really hard to tell because they change the tempo or they process them so much that, I know like you mentioned, I have already played for my college class. I've already played the Public Enemy tune, which now the name is escaping me, "Fight the Power," which is a sample of "Hot Pants" by James Brown, and
right.
It's really hard for them to hear that because it's processed so much. It obviously doesn't sound like the original recording of "Hot Pants."
Right. No, I know. So Cantaloupe Island, I think the tempo was increased, but you can certainly hear it. And I guess, when you think about it, probably out of all the 1960s jazz records, at least, that might be the most known sample that comes from one. I could be wrong. I'm not like an expert in hip hop sampling, but like you said, I think most people would know it from the 1993 Us Three recording.
Right.
So Steve is a true historian when it comes to the history of drummers. And here he talks about how jazz drummers inspired rock drummers and the similarities between some of the drummers of the 1960s and beyond.
And it's interesting because going back to Tony's playing, if you think about it, it's pretty like a lot of rock drummers. I think good ones, even somebody like Ringo, and I'm just saying that because obviously he's not technically admired, but Ringo, Charlie Watts, absolutely John Bonham, all those guys, because they were listening to the jazz drummers and they were listening to the Motown and the R&B drummers, who of course had already listened to the jazz drummers. A lot of those guys, there's a swing in their playing, I think, that's what a lot of people miss, especially when drummers try to play Led Zeppelin tunes, and they're just going for the heaviness and so forth. But they're missing the feel and the swing.
In this clip, Steve and I discussed Tony Williams' personality, and I think it's quite interesting. Check it out.
Tony was very opinionated, and I kind of, he was a little more subtle than let's say somebody like Buddy Rich. But I remember reading interviews about him, and he was often not. He wasn't shy about expressing his opinion. Like just for example, like the thing about when he called brushes cute, But he would talk about being in the dressing room with band members, and you and I have had these conversations too, about band members coming in and throwing their jackets on top of his drum cases, and saying, "What are you doing? Those are my cases. Like, this is not a place for your jackets."
Right,
so
right.
He was very he was I don't want to say defensive, but he definitely defended the honor and the importance of the drums.
Yeah. He was almost like an elder statesman of the drums, and yet the guy,
Yes.
I mean, what did he live to 51 years old or something?
I think he was 52, unfortunately. Yeah, and I remember that was, a lot of times people pass on. It's like, well, okay, well, they were, 85, and they were a great musician, and they contributed so much, and they had a nice long life. So it doesn't really affect you. But I remember him because he had gone in for routine gallbladder surgery, and he was recovering from that, and it was like the next day, and he had a heart attack like in the hospital. So that was a bit of a shock. It's almost like it's you wonder like what the universe, sometimes I hate to get all metaphysical about it, but you wonder if the universe gave him all that at such a young age, and he was going to start contributing at such a young age, and then it was his time to go also at a young age.
Yeah, it's funny. I think about that sometimes, and I'm almost like, sometimes I'm like thankful. I'm like, thank God I wasn't a child prodigy. I'd probably be dead.
Now we're getting morbid. People are going to be like, what the heck are these guys talking about?
Well, think about, just jazz, the history of jazz even. Like, I mean, a lot of the guys did it to themselves, right? But
sure.
a guy like a Bix Beiderbecke, not Scott LaFaro, the Clifford Brown. I mean, these guys all were in their 20s.
Yep.
It's remarkable,
One of my favorite moments of our discussion is a history of jazz drumming and jazz recording, a discussion on those topics. I think you might find this one interesting.
Because if you think about it, by the 60s, the instrument was only 60 years old. It was basically put together, with the European instruments, but the concept of putting it all together, and then of course, playing some of it with your feet was an African American concept. So I think by the time those two guys came around, it was then it was fully fleshed out, and it was really an integrated full instrument. That's not to say that it wasn't before, but as far as the full concept of what you could do with all four limbs.
Right. I mean, I think maybe the polyrhythmic aspect of their playing does really have a specific connection, I think, to African drumming.
Sure.
And I would put Art Blakey in that mix too, I think.
Yeah.
But it's funny that you mentioned, like, you don't really think the drums. I mean, the drums you could basically strike anything and call it a drum, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Or make a percussive sound.
Yeah, I think
the drum set specifically, I never really thought about that the drum set, is really not that old of an instrument.
No. And then of course, there's there's always the economic factors that people sometimes don't think about, and the New Orleans marching bands. Now all of a sudden, if I shouldn't say marching, because obviously you're not marching with a drum set, but coming out of that tradition where you had separate bass drum, cymbal, and snare drum players. Well, now you only have to pay one guy instead of two or three.
Yeah.
If you put them all together, yeah.
Right.
But yeah, I think those drummers are, and of course they were going to influence all the rock drummers like Bonham and Ginger Baker and so forth. But I think those guys, what they were doing with the instrument, they sort of showed everybody, okay, this is something that, you can be an equal partner in the music, and I'm not just here to keep time. Although I think both of them would say that's your number one job.
Right. That's true. And then, like you talk about, I'm kind of hung up on this now, like the age of the drum set formation that we're used to. But beyond that, the drum recordings of drums have changed dramatically too, because in the New Orleans times, the technicality of recording didn't really allow for the drums to be fully heard.
No.
So a lot of those drummers had to play, wood blocks and
right.
all this auxiliary percussion, like the Louis Armstrong Hot 5 sessions,
Yep.
So,
and it's funny because, and I know you probably have a similar thing with, there's, anything that you're really trying to listen to, that you're trying to hone into. And I think a lot of those recordings would have been bass tuba, right?
Yeah, because they recorded that.
When I was younger, I heard older drummers say, "Oh, you got to listen to Baby Dodds," with Louis Armstrong. It's like, well, you can't hear him.
Right.
I mean, he's on the recording, but you don't hear anything.
Yeah, I think the only way to really hear a guy like Baby Dodds was to have been in the room with him, because recordings probably don't he's not even playing his primary stuff. He's hitting wood blocks or
I think there might be I think there are some. I recall seeing there's some like really short, like few second clips of him playing that somehow survived on video. I remember seeing it at one point. I don't know if it's on YouTube. Again, just in general, you watch some of those guys from that era, or even a little bit after, like Sid Catlett, Joe Jones. It's incredible what they're playing. They're playing this stuff, and the instrument's like 30 years old.
Yeah.
It's like, how did you invent that, so soon?
Yeah, Chick Webb maybe even too, but he's under-recorded,
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
One of the albums that didn't make the list for the 30 albums for 1964 was the album Miles Davis 4 and More. And it actually is one of my favorite albums, but of course this podcast is not about what I like the most, but about the albums that I think were the most impactful. So the reason I'm telling you this is that on that album is the same exact rhythm section of Tony Williams, Ron Carter, and Herbie Hancock. And of course, it's with Miles Davis, and playing the tenor saxophone on this is George Coleman. This is before Wayne Shorter entered the group. Now, my point is, Steve and I, along with a fantastic guitarist named Doug Clark, recorded a version of the song 4, which is included, of course, on that album. So I know you've listened to Steve and I talk. Now maybe you can enjoy Steve and myself playing along with the great Doug Clark. I hope you enjoy our version of 4.